Hi, everyone. Now, what we want to talk about today is, and again, I don't want to make this a long video, but I want to talk a little bit about creation stories, and particularly how one situates the creation stories of Genesis within the context of the ancient Near East. Now, I've talked about this before. One of the biggest challenges we face is, particularly with regard to reading the Bible, is the Bible is so available. It's so prevalent. It is so interwoven into society and literature, and it's available everywhere that it's very, very tempting for people to automatically completely overlook its complexities. And because it's been so simply preached and communicated from country preachers and TV evangelists alike, that those people have somewhat dumbed down the literature and made it seem as though this bit of complex literature is easy to interpret, easy to evaluate, easy to examine, and taken basically something of a fantastic piece of art that you might find, a complex art that you may find in a museum, and reduced it to that of a throw blanket that one would just toss out into the street. And as a result, the complexities, the context, the ancient Near Eastern situation in which specifically the biblical stories generate and are written is really overlooked. And I see this specifically even among people, even in a class like this, where discussions occur and people start saying, well, I believe that, and they'll throw out some analysis or some view of the biblical literature. And I typically don't want to correct them too quickly, but the first thing I want to say is, now hold on a second. You wouldn't say that about any other body of complex literature with that type of diversity, artistry, and antiquity. You wouldn't say that about the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts. You wouldn't say that about Babylonian texts that we have that are written in Akkadian. You wouldn't say that about any other ancient body of ancient literature that has that level of diversity and complexity. But because the Bible is so prominent, because it's so widely available in our culture, because just about anybody can go down to any place and just grab one, or even find it online, then somehow it therefore deserves to be treated simplistically. And so that's something I really want to help you avoid if I can. So let's talk about origin stories. First of all, the book of Genesis is, and we've talked about this as a little bit of a review, but the book of Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. In fact, the word Genesis, it gets its title from the first word in the Hebrew writing. That is, the word is in Latin is Genesis. It's in the beginning, which filtered through Hebrew, Latin, German winds up having the title Genesis. So in the beginning, that's the first book. And what it does is the first chapters gives an origin story of how the world comes about. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to throw out, a couple of terms. One is cosmology. The cosmology is the view of the cosmos, really. Remember, I've talked a little bit before about theology, how its theology is logic or God logic, or your logic, logos, ology coming from logos, thinking, or logic, and theos coming from God. So theology is you're thinking about all things related to God. Well, so also cosmology is what one's thinking is about all things related to the cosmos, the universe, everything. So your cosmology is how you view the world, how it all works, what are its components, how is it all held together. So in a modern context, unless you're part of that flat earth society, your cosmology is that the Earth is a sphere, and it is traveling through space, and it rotates, and that rotation that rotation means that sometimes the part of the Earth that you live on is sometimes turning toward the sun, and sometimes it's turning away from the sun. The sun does not revolve around the Earth, and thus creating the days. Instead, the Earth is traveling through space, Slowly, it passes around the sun once a year, but for the most part, the days are created because the earth turns away, turns, and therefore you're not always looking at the sun, but the sun is always on. It doesn't turn off, it doesn't turn on, it is always on, and you're just facing, your part of the earth is facing it or not. That there are other planets, that there's a universe out there, and that cosmology is informed by the scientific view of everything. So the cosmology is, your cosmology is that not only are, we are on a sphere that's traveling through space, and it has its gravity, it has its size and mass and its weather patterns and so forth, but also there are other planets in our solar system, and we even see some of the amazing images that come from NASA on the surface of Mars. But that cosmology that is all, what is the universe, what's in it, and how does it operate? So in a modern context, particularly in the modern world, your cosmology suggests that these things oftentimes operate by themselves. That even if you're a theist, even if you're one with a religious tradition who thinks that God is responsible for everything being created, you still would suggest your cosmology still, particularly if you're a monotheist, you would still think that your cosmology would include this idea that natural elements operate based upon a set of natural laws, and that it doesn't always rain because the gods are granting rain or angry with you. And it doesn't always lightning because the ancient god Baal was throwing his staff across the sky and striking something, or Zeus for that matter. And that the mountains erupt because of tectonic plates that are producing magma and different geological forces in subduction zones, or earthquakes happen in transverse faults. Those things happen because they just occur in a natural world. Your cosmology may not include the idea that there's a God related to everything, and it's always because of some activity of the gods that natural forces occur. So that's your cosmology, how you view the world, how you view everything that is. So in the ancient world, cosmology is very different. The cosmology is much more phenomenological. Now, what do I mean by phenomenological? Now, phenomenon is an occurrence that you witness. It's something that happens in the natural world, happens among people, or happens among natural things. And it's how you experience them. It's the natural phenomenon. It's an occurrence. So in an ancient world, it's very understandable that their cosmology would be phenomenological. The earth is down, the heavens and the skies are up. So it's, you wouldn't just be observant see that the earth is round and an orb flying through space. What you would see is that the earth is flat under your feet, that the sky is above you, and that the sky has certain attributes. The sun is there, the stars are there, the clouds are there, and rain comes from there. All precipitation comes from above, but also, so there's water above, because that's where it comes from. I mean, if I'm someone who's an phenomenologically ancient, in a cosmology of the ancient world, there are certain things that I would just know, and they make common sense. So the idea, I would turn to a person and say, so do you understand where water comes from? It obviously comes from above, because it falls upon us. So, and where is that water stored? Well, you'd say, well, it's stored in clouds. Well, not stupid. Obviously, it's not stored in clouds. Clouds can't contain that much water. It's stored in something containing within the skies. And so imagine like floodgates or gates being opened and water comes on you, because that's why it can flood sometimes, because some gates are thrown open in the sky and the water falls. You say, well, whatever is in the sky, where are those doors being contained? Well, obviously, it's going to be, if there's a ceiling, that's where the stars are embedded. Because again, you're still thinking of that. You obviously, it's very reasonable that you would think of the sky as a actual structure, something for which the sun travels, that the stars reside, and that water falls from occasionally, because that's what you experience. What else do you experience? One, that there is water under you, because you dig the ground, you dig in a groundwater system and you find water. There's wells there. And so obviously water is contained there because sometimes it flows. If you dig far enough, you find water, and it flows along the ground in the river systems. So that's cosmology is based upon phenomenon, the human experience that you find there. And throughout the Bible, you see this sense of wisdom being gained from just watching how the world works. Even in the book of Proverbs, later on, the repository of Hebrew wisdom, there's this idea of look at how the world works. Don't you see how it operates and wisdom that is gleaned from there? Look at how ants store up what they need to do, and then they're later on, and they work so hard, and therefore they're secure. And this admonishment of not to be a sluggard, of apply yourself. So the idea is that the operating or the seeing how the world functions according to your observational wisdom. And that's the cosmology of the ancient world. Now, also, in the ancient world, the norm is polytheistic, many gods. Now, remember I may have talked about this before, that in cultures there will be different types of beliefs about God. There's monotheism, which is mono meaning one, theism, the one God. There's monotheism. There's polytheism, many gods. So. And then there's a third category that is not quite as common, that's Hannotheism. And monotheism is there's one God. Polytheism, there are many gods. And typically, however many that you need in order to explain the natural phenomena of the world. Your cosmology and your theology of how many gods are closely tied. Because, again, it doesn't make logical sense that only one God is responsible for the diversity of the natural world. That you would say that one God that there's one God, that handles the idea of life, death, birth, and also the same God handles crops and rain and things related to agriculture. And so the idea of multiple gods explaining the different phenomena that happen in the world is the norm of the ancient world. We tend to, in the modern context, just assume when we talk about God, our rhetoric is very much inclined toward monotheistic language, but it's not the norm in terms of world beliefs and particularly in world history. So the norms of the ancient world are polytheism. There's a God for everything, and typically they're either elementally tied, to rain, death, birth, sex, rule, things like this, or they are regional in scale. So the God there's a God of that town over there, but this is the God of this town, or there's the God of those mountains, but not the God of the sea. So there's polytheism, but then the third category, Hannotheism, it's less frequent that this is true, but Hannotheism is one of, there's a main God, there are smaller gods, but there's a main God. So there may be smaller gods that you can appeal to, but really ultimately there's a hierarchy of gods, and so there's a greatest one. And typically Hannotheism will kind of acknowledge the existence of other gods, but still have your favorite. So Hannotheism is, well, my God is the best one, even though there are many. So that's a little bit less common, but still, though, there is a phenomenon that happens in the ancient world of Hannotheism. And to that end, there's even parts of the Bible that you can say seem to kind of without teaching Hannotheism, seem to acknowledge its existence. So those type of things. But still, though, theology about gods and the cosmology about the world are closely interlinked in the ancient world. So, and origin stories of the ancient world, whether they be in Babylon, in Egypt, Hebrew origin stories from Genesis, or origin stories even in Native America, or in Mesoamerica of prior to the Spanish writing, or even further over into Asia of China. Origin stories tend to have this linkage between cosmology and the theology of the gods. Now, one other thing now let me introduce another term. Just like Genesis means in the beginning, and therefore Genesis is going to be in the term of how things came to be, or as a description of how things came to be. In modern terms, we have this idea of the genesis of the NFL, the genesis of our political system, the genesis of something is basically talking about how it came about. Well, take that terminology and slap it onto our words like cosmos. There's cosmology, and there is also cosmogeny. Cosmogeny is how the world came about. Cosmogeny is how the cosmos and everything that is in it came to be. So origin stories or creation stories are basically the cosmogeny of that cultural system. So there's the biblical cosmogony is the creation stories, and there's also Babylonian cosmogonies and Egyptian cosmogonies, and every major large culture winds up having a cosmogony of some kind. Now remember I talked about how theology and cosmology are interlinked. Therefore, almost all ancient cultures have a theogony, how the gods came about. Now, let me talk a little bit about theogony for a second. This is where it can get crazy, because theogonies in the ancient world, particularly in that of the world of the Bible, are the norm. Theogonies in ancient Egypt are closely related and are interlinked with their cosmogony. So when a new element comes to be, typically that's completely interlinked with how a new God comes to be. So elements will grow and change. For example, first you maybe have a moon. In ancient Egypt, you have a moon, which is the sun. It's the sun god. And then if the god sneezes, out of that comes, when you sneeze, what comes from that? When you sneeze, a chew, when you sneeze comes moisture and air, right? So, right now, in the age of COVID, everyone's very aware of what is transmitted when someone sneezes. But in ancient Egypt, a moon sneezes. Moisture and air proceed from him. As a result, that is the creation of moisture and air, which wind up getting names of Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut are moisture and air, and once they receive their proper names, they are now animated beings, gods, if you will. And every time, and then those gods are engendered, and so they wind up. And as gods proliferate, they can make more gods. So there are gods that beget gods. And in that, you have to think about the way in which you view the proliferation of gods in the same way that people proliferate. That more people are made simply by pair bonding and then having children. And then the gods proliferate that way. But every time new gods are made, that's also an aspect of the created world as well. So every time a created world, element of the created world occurs, then that's a new God coming into being as well. So that's how cosmogony and theogony are closely tied. The same winds up being true in the Gilgamesh epic, or specifically the Atrahasis epic later on in Babylon. So their creation stories wind up having origin stories related to Marduk and others, where the creation stories, the gods proliferate and the world grows and elements of creation expand as a result. Now, having said that, that's where the biblical or the Genesis cosmogony, the Genesis origin story is unique, because its antiquity is supportable because we see things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or support the antiquity of the Genesis story. Much of I've talked about a little bit before about how Julius Wellshausen's documentary hypothesis that the JDP committee forms the Genesis story well after the time of David. It's been really challenged, and in many cases is no longer considered mainstream because of such a flawed methodology. The antiquity of the Genesis story really has support for occurring well in or being written well in the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt. Well, at that time, Egyptian creation stories are the norm. Later on, Babylonian story would also be very prevalent. But the Egyptian creation story is coming out of Memphis and also Memphis and in the Northern Kingdom and also Memphis to the north, and also Hierapolis to the south. These have origin stories as well. Well, that's the context in which you wind up having a creation story in the book of Genesis, arguably two creation stories because they are so distinct, the story of Genesis 1 and story of Genesis 2 and 3, and they wind up operating in similar ways in terms of being mythological, showing the characters that generate, saying something about human capacity, human behavior, human proclivities, and it's in essence forms a theology of the human condition, really. In fact, I think I've shared this before, that in theological circles, and there's actually a category of anthropology, and it's not to be confused with the anthropology that we study for culture in here at the university. But the anthropology in theological circles is the theological examination of the human condition, and it looks at those origin stories. Now, interestingly, what makes the biblical story about the biblical cosmogony unique is that there's no accompanying theogony. The biblical cosmogony assumes that God preexists. So there's no accompanying theogony to that creation story. First of all, it's monotheistic, not polytheistic. In essence, it glaringly teaches monotheism in just juxtaposition to its ancient Near Eastern neighbors that through their cosmogony not only teach polytheism, but show what now aspects of the created world all the gods are associated with and what their function is. Contrast to that, the story of Genesis has a theology of monotheism, because it's an origin story of how everything comes to be, but the story assumes the preexistence of God. No new gods are created in the process. On the contrary, normally where you would have the certain elements of creation receive a proper name, certain elements of the natural world receive a proper name, and in doing so they become animate and become gods. The Genesis 1 talks about the creation of the sun and the moon, but it doesn't actually name them. It just calls them the greater and lesser lights. So in that moment in a cosmogony where normally something receives a proper name and is then therefore from then on a god to be worshipped, those parts of creation in Genesis 1 don't get a name. Even the man and the woman in Genesis 1 don't get a proper name. They're just described as the man and the woman. In fact, later on, the word Adam in Hebrew just means man. So it's difficult to actually know in the biblical account where Adam goes from just the generic word for man to a proper name. But it is used as a proper name later on, but in those creation stories, he's just the man, and the woman is just the woman. In fact, her proper name winds up getting the proper name after they're expelled from the garden. And theologians have actually considered that possibly being, one of the early indications that having been expelled from the garden, humanity will now experience certain problems. And one of the problems that humanity experiences is that the man thinks that it falls to him to name the woman. And, who the heck do you think you are naming the woman? She's not your possession. She's not your creature, things like this. So some theologians actually consider the man's naming of the woman, Eve, to be like usurping his authority, usurping his position. Never mind, that's kind of a rabbit trail. Point is that they don't have proper names. So nothing gets a proper name up until that point, so as not to be worshipped as a god. So these creation stories, plural, are very distinct in ancient Near Eastern literature for teaching monotheism. This is revolutionary in the ancient world. No other creation story does this, and that's what makes it stand apart. So, therefore, in order to really appreciate the biblical story of Genesis, it has to be appreciated within the context of its ancient literature. So, there are certain authors that help us do that. So there are various different authors like John Walton. I don't know if you've described some of the books here, like Genesis 1 and Ancient Cosmogeny. John Currid talks about ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. Even Peter Enns talks about some of his books that are a little bit more controversial on the evolution of Adam. And so stories or writers like John Walden and Peter Enns and others help us appreciate these creation stories within the context of the ancient world, so that we can not only get at what their message is and apply it better, but also appreciate what it's saying to an original audience. So an ancient audience may be who have been where ancient stories of their ancient Near Eastern neighbors had been circulated, because stories travel either through trade or through contact of different times. And this creation story is going to wind up having a stark contrast. Just enough similarity so a person knows what type of story they're listening to, but then when you tell it differently, it has an entirely different message. And the message being that, one, contrary to the other ancient Near Eastern neighbors, this God is pre-existing. It actually has no theogony story. There is no story of the Bible. It's absent any story in which God comes to being, unlike other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. In the cosmogony of it, no other gods are named. So therefore, there's only one God throughout. And so these type of ways in which reading the Genesis within this ancient Near Eastern context and appreciating other ancient Near Eastern creation stories help us appreciate that. Now, like for example, ancient Egyptian creation, the Atrahasis epic of the ancient Babylon is their flood story. So there's some similarities there. Well, people try to account for that. Well, does that mean that there's if someone sees two stories, the first question that comes up is, well, then which one is true? Well, I would say that those stories are meant to convey which story is true in terms of actually historically occurred and the other one's just off? Or are those stories meant to convey something that's true about people, about the nature of man, about the human interaction with the divine? And that's the truth you're to glean from that. So this idea that in the modern context, the historicity of a thing drives whether or not it can be accepted as truth, that's something that has to be, we have to kind of reevaluate whether or not that type of criteria is applicable to every story that we encounter. Now, later on in the Bible, that stories are presenting themselves as more historically factual, and they're even archaeologically verifiable in some respects. So that later on in the Bible, these things can be taken more and more as historical. But with regard to ancient creation stories, cosmogonies, those stories are taken and they convey not what happened or not what was, but what is. Not how God acted in the past, but how God acts with people now, how the gods act with people now. So appreciate that these stories within their ancient context. That helps us better apply, if in a religious context, it helps us better to apply their message today. But even just in an analysis of the literature, it helps us appreciate the complexities and what the original audience would likely have gleaned from it at the time. So that's what I want to say about that in terms of creation stories, origin stories, and specifically appreciating the complexities of diving into cosmogonies of the ancient world. And particularly the one in Genesis that is revolutionary in its presentation. Its cosmogony lacks any theogony, and that is unique and unheard of, really, in the ancient world. So when we're talking about keeping things or appreciating things within their context, it's probably one of the most glaring and striking aspects of the Bible's origin stories that we understand. All right, that's all I have to say about right now.